All right, so this is more specific than it was yesterday. This is going to be covering a lot of the foundational document type stuff that we actually need to go over, right? So some of this, hopefully a lot of this is review. Okay? Hopefully a lot of this is review for you because you should have already covered much, if not all of this in a U.S. history class. Okay, guys, I don't really have time to stop because you are continuing to talk. Okay, additionally, even with as loud as I am, right, I'm trying to record this in the event because if you're ever not here, you're probably going to want it recorded so that you can get access to it, right? If all that the recording picks up is your voice, that's not helping nobody, okay? All right, so we're looking at the Constitution, we're looking at the aspects of why the Constitution was created, okay? Essentially, and this all comes from the preamble, right? Like, the preamble to the Constitution, if you were to actually read it, lists a whole bunch of things that the Constitution aims to do. Like, why did we write it? So that we could, maintain peace, right? Promote justice, find happiness. Very vague ideals that we aim to achieve, right? Now, obviously, at some point in time in this course, we'll argue over whether or not those ideals have actually been achieved, right? Or to what extent those ideals have been achieved. But that's what the preamble to the Constitution does. It outlines the actual goals, right? So, in sort of American history, if you look at the foundation of the United States, we really have a couple of different foundings, right? Some of those different foundings are a result of different issues that had been going on, right? So, first thing that I want you to understand is if you go back, again, you should have learned this in U.S. history class, right? We have the 13 different colonies that all exist along the East Coast. I would hope, and if you, not that I was here last year, but if you ever sat through my dual U.S. history class, right, you would learn that the 13 colonies were really sort of 4 unique, distinct places, right? And a whole lot of difference between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. There's just not. North South Carolina might as well be the same state, right? But Northern South Carolina and New York are not the same. Okay? They weren't the same in 1787. They weren't the same in 1750. They're just not the same, right? So there's all sorts of regional issues and interests that are going to have to get taken into account there. Okay? Prior to the Revolution, right, we are an English colony. That means we are subject to rules and laws created by Parliament, by the King of England. Okay? For the most part, just so you understand, for the most part, in American history, like colonial history, the British kind of left us alone, right? Like the actual British crown, the British monarchy, the British Parliament, they didn't do anything to America, right? They essentially sort of let America rule itself and self-govern. Maybe with the exception of like the big cities, right? Like Boston, New York, like those places that were commercially developed already. Like, then maybe England was a little involved in what was going on. But, like, England did not have a clue what was happening in, like, Western Virginia. Right? It's just not feasible for the British monarchy, the British Parliament, right? Like, there's England. It's just not feasible in 1740 for them to have any idea what's going on in the frontier of Virginia, where there's only, like, 50 white folk. Right? Now, eventually what happens is we have the French and Indian War, right? And so, after the French and Indian War, and again, hopefully you know this from U.S. history, right? The French and the Indians fought the Americans and the British, okay? Britain wins. A whole bunch of things happen. Predominantly, wars are flippin' expensive. They're expensive. It costs a lot of money to wage war. Right? Because you got to pay the soldiers, you got to buy the bullets, the guns, the food, the boots, the clothes, the coats. You got to build forts. You got to do all sorts of stuff. Right? War is expensive. Where do you get that money from?
Taxes.
Taxes. Well, here's the thing. I told you a minute ago, Parliament pretty much left the colonies alone, yes?
Yeah.
That also means in terms of taxation, there was very limited taxation that was occurring. Now, the French and Indian War has ended, right? And the British basically want to look at the colonists and be like, listen, bro, we came all the way across the ocean here, right? And we helped you beat the French in order to, like, make things better for y'all out there. We're going to need you to pay us back, right? Like, we fronted the cost for the war. We're going to need you to pay us back. And so there's a variety of taxes that get implemented by Parliament on the colonists without any sort of colonial say-so. This is where that whole, like, no taxation without representation concept comes from. Because this is not a U.S. history class, I don't care that you memorize all the individual specific acts. I don't care, right? Here's what I want you to know. Britain tried to tax. America was like, no, I'm good, dog. I don't want to pay your taxes, right? And then America would engage in some sort of behavior that would make the tax futile. England would be like, all right, we'll get rid of the tax. It's okay. Then England would create a different tax, and America would be like, yeah, we're not going to pay that one either, right? Eventually sort of culminating in this idea of the Boston Tea Party, right, which was a tea on, well, first it was actually a monopoly provided to the East India Trading Company, which obviously negatively affects people like Hancock and businessmen here in the colonies, right? And then we've got to buy all of our tea from, like, Britain and East India and whatnot. It limits, in fact, the term you should have learned in U.S. history is called mercantilism, right, which is really an economic system where you have some sort of mother country that's benefiting from commercial or trade with colonies or inferior companies, right? So again, you should know about the Boston Tea Party just in pop culture, right? Sam Adams dresses himself up as an Indian. By the way, Sam Adams was like 6'4" and like whiter than white, right? So it's kind of comical that that's the dude that did it. But they go out there and they dump all the tea into the Boston Harbor, right? And that is really the precursor, sort of the first real act of independence and divine. Like, the Declaration of Independence, the actual independence movement could probably be traced back to the Boston Tea Party, right? There's the Boston Massacre and a whole bunch of other things. But ultimately, at this point, we're on the path now to a Declaration of Independence and removing ourselves from British rule, right? So the Declaration itself is actually a highly philosophical document, right? A lot of this comes from an Enlightenment thinker, right? A philosopher named John Locke, right? John Locke had this idea that people were basically endowed with 3 rights, okay? 3 rights, that's it. If you have these 3 things in life, you're good, and that's all you need. And the reality is government should only exist to ensure that nobody infringes upon these 3 rights of yours, right? 1 is life. I can't murder you. Make sense? 2, liberty, freedom. I cannot enslave you. Which is obviously dicey. We'll get there, okay? And then 3, I have a right to property, right? You have a right to property, so I can't just go up and be like, this is mine now. Right? Like, doesn't work that way. Government exists in order to protect your property from me or my property from you. That's it. That's it. That's it. Right? That's all. Okay? If you've got those 3 things, you should be set in life. Okay? So it is a very philosophical document and drawing from the Enlightenment, but it's also an airing of grievances. Right? Like, if you were to actually pull up the Declaration of Independence, it's like this big long list of here's all the reasons why the king sucks. Okay? Like, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, like, right? Sometimes it's been referred to in history classes as like a great breakup letter, right? And it's really one of those things where if you've never had that terrible cliche, hopefully you're too young, hopefully this never happens to you where somebody looks at you and goes, it's not you, it's me. First of all, they're lying, it's you. Okay, that's why they're breaking up with you. Okay, America doesn't do that. Like, literally, it's like, nah, dog, it's you, and here's why. Right? And when I tell you, like it starts there. And it ends like 2 pages times later. What?
It's just so tiny.
Well, yeah, this is a very small document. But my point is, there's like 20 reasons, right? Like it's not like oh, we just don't want to pay you taxes. No, there's like 20 some odd reasons as to why the king and England suck, right? So we've declared our independence, right? Now we've got to figure out what we're going to do, right? And so the first sort of attempt at governance in America is the Articles of Confederation. Okay? Now on some level you could call the Articles of Confederation our first quote-unquote constitution, but you should understand that a confederation is a very specific type of government, right? The best example that I can give you of a confederation today would be like the United Nations. Anybody know anything about the United Nations? Okay, there's like 180 some odd countries in the UN. I haven't looked it up in years. I don't care, right? But it's 180 some odd countries or whatever the number is who are basically like, hey, we're going to be nice to each other and we're going to like help each other, right? But what happens when two members of the United Nations, i.e. Russia and Ukraine, go to war with one another? What does the UN do? Nothing. Nothing at all, right? Confederations are sort of worthless, right? Because they are sovereign entities that are in some very loose alliance with one another, right? So what does sovereign mean? What'd you say?
Like over everything.
Self-controlling, right? Like they control themselves. That's sovereignty, right? All of you should have some level of sovereignty, like you make decisions for yourself, right? I mean, maybe not 100% of your decisions yet. You still live at home, but like once you stop living at home, then you will make all your decisions for yourself until you get married, okay? And your wife will make decisions for you, all right? But the Confederation lacks enforcement, right? Like that's the big problem, okay? And there's, just so you also understand, there's a significant problem when it comes to like the psychological aspect of like which state is better and which state, like you realize that in the United Nations, America is equal to Djibouti, right? Like that, you understand that's comical, yes? I mean, no disrespect to Djibouti. I mean, no disrespect to Djibouti, but Djibouti is a real country, yes ma'am.
Okay.
Oh, I thought you said.
No, guys. This right here is Djibouti. Djibouti is a real country.
Oh, okay.
It's right there. That's like the Horn of Africa. It's right next to Somalia. The capital of Djibouti is Djibouti. So it's Djibouti. Got it?
Okay.
Okay. Now, if you don't remember anything else from my course, you're going to learn that Djibouti is an actual country. D-J-I-B-O-U-T-I, just in case you cared. Okay? So, under a confederation, there's a lack of like enforcement because there's sovereignty amongst the individual members, right? There's a lack of, well, there's too much equality in the sense that in a confederation, each sovereign entity is equal to one another, right? Which is problematic and will become problematic, right? So ultimately, the Articles of Confederation suck. Okay? They have no courts, they have no enforcement, they have no executive, they can't tax, all kinds of problems. Eventually what happens, again, should have learned this in U.S. history, we get a guy named Daniel Shea. Shea was I believe captain, so I'm going to say captain. I don't care his rank, but Shea served in the Revolutionary War, right? Shea is actually owed money for his service in the Revolutionary War, right? Except now Daniel Shea can't pay the taxes on his farm in western Massachusetts. Why? Right? Because he doesn't have any money. Why doesn't he have any money? In part because he hasn't been paid by the government, by a national government. A national government that can't tax. So how's it going to get money? I don't know either. Like, that's the only way government gets money, is to tax you. Right? So now Shay's going to lose his land because he can't pay his taxes despite the fact that another government that he operates under owes him money. That's a little ridiculous. Alright? So what ultimately ends up happening is Washington has to re-raise the Virginia Army, right, and go up there and put down this rebellion. Because here's the other thing that happens under the Articles of Confederation, right? Shay is leading a rebellion in Massachusetts, right? And Massachusetts calls up Georgia and goes, hey, dog, we need help. And what does Georgia say? No, I'm good, man. That's a you problem. You fix it. Because under a confederation, there's nothing that requires Georgia to go and help. Well, especially if that's seen as like an internal problem within the sovereign state of Massachusetts. Okay? So, out of this, we are going to meet again, yet again, for another convention. A whole bunch of rich, white, landowning white folk getting together and be like, we got to fix stuff. Here's the thing. Initially, they just wanted to fix the Articles of Confederation. That's it. We just going to fix them. The problem is, many problems. In order to fix the Articles of Confederation, you had to have unanimous consent. We know what unanimous consent means? It means everybody agrees. Right? Do you know how hard it is to get everybody to agree on something? We can't get everybody to agree that the earth is round. Do you realize then how hard it is to get everybody to agree on abstract political ideals? Alright? The other problem is, not even every state sent somebody to the convention. Right? Now, if one state's absent, we really can't get all 13 states to agree because somebody's not there. So, they lock themselves into a room and they're going to redo everything. They're going to start over from scratch. And they're going to write the Constitution. There's a whole bunch of compromises that have to happen here. How are we going to get to where we get? Again, most of this should be a review from U.S. history, so I'm going to blow through it quickly. We have the Virginia Plan, large state plan, based upon representation, because lots of people live in Virginia. We have the Jersey Plan, or the small state plan. They want equal representation amongst the states, right? Ultimately, we get the Connecticut Compromise, sometimes referred to as the Great Compromise. We get a bicameral legislature. That means two chambers, right? So we have two houses, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, okay? The House of Representatives is the Virginia idea based upon population. The Senate is the Jersey idea, equal representation. Every state has two senators, regardless of their population. California and their 40 million people, two senators. Wyoming and their 50 people, two senators, right? I jest, Wyoming has 500,000, but still, not many. Three-fifths compromise figures out what to do with slaves, right? Basically, the idea is, initially, the states have to give money to the national government based upon the population of the state, right? So if you live in Virginia, do you want black people, do you want slaves to count as population for the purposes of giving up your money? No. Do you want them to count as population for the purposes of getting more seats in the House of Representatives? Yes. Connecticut wants the exact opposite, right? I need you to understand that everybody in America in 1787 is hypocritical when it comes to black people. They only want black people to count when it benefits them. So that's how we end up with the three-fifths compromise. Okay? This is not just a Southern problem with hypocrisies. Okay? So, we're going to create a new government. That government is meant to prevent excessive democracy. It's meant to prevent all sorts of things, honestly. It's actually meant to stop stuff from happening. Okay? And we'll get to that as we go there, right? But here's basically the idea, right? We're going to limit the power of the national government, right? And we're going to limit the power of the national government really two ways. Two really, really predominant ways. One, we're going to divide power. So we have separation of powers. That comes from a dude named Montesquieu, right? Who basically comes up with this idea. We divide powers amongst the government. So we have three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. We'll cover all three in depth throughout this semester, right? So that way we prevent the government or one entity within the national government from wielding too much power. The other thing that we do is we create a system called federalism, okay? Federalism is the idea of dividing power between a national government and some sort of local government, right? So we have a central government. That central government exists in Washington, D.C., and then we have state and local government, okay? And sometimes things are going to fall to the jurisdiction of local government. Sometimes they're going to fall to the jurisdiction of the national government. We will talk about federalism. Federalism will take me 2 days to lecture on next week, okay? We'll go over federalism in a great amount of detail prior to your test next Friday, all right? So, House and the Senate, different terms, structurally different, meant to be different because they were designed to be different. The House of Representatives is elected by the people. In 1787, they only get to serve for 2 years. They're supposed to serve for 2 years and then go home and do their real job. Politician is not supposed to be a real job. That's not a job. That's something you do for a couple of years and then go back to your real job. Okay? We're not supposed to have people like Mitch McConnell who are in government for 50 years. Joe Biden's been in government for 50 years. You know what jobs Joe Biden has had? What? Joe Biden is now, what, 80 years old, roughly? In Joe Biden's lifetime, Joe Biden has had 4 jobs. 4. He's currently the president of the United States. Right? He spent 8 years as vice president of the United States. He spent 30-some-odd years as senator from Delaware, and he spent like 14 months as an attorney. That's it. No, that's not good. Not good. No. You shouldn't have a real job for like 14 months and then be like, you know what I know enough of? Life, to run life and everything for everybody else. Bad idea. Okay? It's not supposed to work that way. Okay? But the Senate actually is supposed to be very different than the House. The House is supposed to be the people. We elect them every 2 years, get them in, get them out, move on in life. The Senate, on the other hand, stays for 6 years. Okay? They're supposed to actually sort of stop the House from doing stuff, right? Because people be doing dumb stuff. Okay? Believe it or not, democracy lends itself to stupidity. Right? It really does. Because you can whip people into a frenzy with some really dumb ideas, right? And then the House of Representatives will actually institute some dumb ideas. The Senate's supposed to stop that from happening, right? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, this is actually, if you go through and read the Constitution, this is all the things Congress can do, right? I've always joked there's like the national government has 8 jobs. Okay? And I'm actually not far off when I say 8 jobs. Okay? Now, the Constitution breaks it down into like 30 different things that the national government is supposed to do. But like, one is borrow money, one is coin money, one is like spend money. Okay, money is one, right? Like, period. Right? One is maintain an army, one is maintain a navy. Okay, military, 2. Right? Like national defense, 2. But there's a specific list of those things that government can and should be doing listed in Article 1, Section 8. And those are what are called express powers. Express powers are things directly stated in the Constitution. And the alternative to express powers are implied powers, right? Those are things that we basically say are necessary and proper to carry out the roles and responsibilities of the Constitution without actually being in the Constitution, right? So, I just told you a second ago, Congress can borrow money, coin money, print money, spend money, raise money through taxes. Can Congress create a bank? It doesn't say they can, but if you can do all them things with money, shouldn't you have your own bank to regulate all of that? Maybe. Okay, maybe. Right? Right? Conversely, the implied powers covers things like an Air Force, right? Like it says we can maintain an army, we can maintain a navy. Right? Does the Constitution say we can maintain an Air Force? No. Why not? You realize airplanes didn't exist in 1787, right?
Yeah.
So how would they think of an Air Force? They wouldn't have. But if I can maintain an army and I can maintain a navy, once planes are made, I should be able to maintain an Air Force, yes? This is why Donald Trump was able to create the Space Force. Alright? Because now we go to space. And so when aliens finally show up, or already showed up, I don't know. I can't keep up. They might already be here, who knows? The executive branch is the President of the United States. They're going to have all sorts of responsibilities. But again, as part of our system of checks and balances, right, like the President negotiates treaties, but the Senate approves them. President appoints Supreme Court justices, the Senate approves them, right? The Senate and the House create legislation, but then the President has to sign it, or he can veto it. The President is also the only person that can actually force Congress to do their job, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why being a congressman is pretty high on my list of dream jobs, because you actually don't even have to go to work, right? Like if you're Ted Cruz, you just go around Iowa and like beg people to make you President of the United States. And the judicial branch is the third. This is the Supreme Court, right? It is the one that interprets laws. So if there's conflict in laws, this is the branch that interprets them. You should understand this now because we already went over originalism, yes? And the living constitutional theory. And there is nothing in the actual Constitution about judicial review, but I want you to understand that if you were to go and read all of the Federalist Papers, and I don't make you read all the Federalist Papers, and I do not even recall exactly the number in which it is specified, but one of the Federalist Papers says that the Supreme Court exists in order to review laws and ensure that things are operating the way that they're supposed to. Okay? It's something that even though it's not expressly stated in the Constitution, we sort of knew that we wanted that to happen. Okay? The Constitution creates a national sense or a national purpose. It takes that idea of a confederation and it ties us closer together, so we're now lumped in with one another, right? Like we have to work together, right? So I told you that we have the UN, right? Another example of a confederation would be the EU or the European Union. That's a confederation, right? France is a country, Germany is a country. They both belong to the EU. The EU is a little bit stronger a confederacy than the UN because the EU has its own currency, the euro, that all of these countries opt into and participate with, right? But by the Constitution, because we create a national currency, because we create national order and structures, right? This drastically ties the states to one another. Okay? It also ensures that in the event that a state dislikes what the national government does, we actually have an entire article that says the national government wins, right? And we'll talk about that in much more detail. One of the great things about the Constitution is the Constitution authors, the founders, were smart enough to realize that the Constitution, if it was going to last forever, needed to be malleable, right? It needed to be capable of changing. All right, now, the way that it is changed is maybe too difficult, right? There have been no constitutional amendments in your lifetime. There's been one constitutional amendment in my lifetime. There has only been 27 since 1787. 10 of those are the Bill of Rights, which happened all at once. So that drops you down to 17 in like 240 years. 3 of those were the Civil War amendments, right? Like that decreases the actual number of real amendments. One amendment gets rid of alcohol. Another amendment says alcohol can come back. Like the reality is we don't amend the Constitution formally very frequently. There are 4 ways to do that, right? So basically, it can start in Congress, or it can start in a national convention, and then it must go either to state legislatures or to state conventions in order to get ratified. That's the term, right? Ratification is where it becomes an actual part of the Constitution. Just so you understand, we go A to C. On that little chart right there is method 1. 26 of the 27 amendments to the Constitution are method 1. We will never ever use methods 3 and 4. And I understand, I've been teaching long enough and I'm old enough now at this point in my life. I hate using the term never ever. We will never ever use method 3 and 4. Okay? In the event that we called a national convention together, what is more likely is not that we would propose an amendment, but rather that we would write a whole new constitution. Right? Understand that's exactly what happened with the Articles of Confederation, yes? They got together and went, hey, let's fix this. And then they went, let's just start over. All right? So, ratification is where 3/4 of the states agree to it. Okay, so once 3/4 of the states agreed to the Constitution, it became the supreme law of the land. All right, now on the bright side, all 13 of the original colonies did eventually sign it and did eventually ratify it, so nobody was sort of forced into it against their will. Okay? The U.S. has the oldest constitution in the world, but the reality is there are other ways to sort of limit government without it specifically being a constitution, right? Like the Magna Carta is a document that governs English government, and the Magna Carta has been around since, I don't know, 1215 or whatever, all right? The fight for ratification, this gets really controversial. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They will ultimately become our first two political parties, right? They're going to fight it out. The Federalists obviously win. The Anti-Federalists get a Bill of Rights added. That's a compromise that they come up with. Ultimately, the Federalists are going to win out in reality because they are simply better organized, right? The Federalists write, I believe it's 87 Federalist essays arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists write something called the Brutus Papers. They wrote like 10. Okay? They're just not as well organized. And part of the problem is the Anti-Federalists, they're the people that just, they don't want the Constitution, and therefore being on the negative side of something is actually usually harder to deal with, right? The Anti-Federalists are terrified of tyranny. The reality is most of our founders are terrified of tyranny in a wide variety of reasons. Okay? And I do need you to understand, you can have tyranny in a lot of different ways as well, right? You can have tyranny of the majority, you can have tyranny of the minority, right? You can have individual tyranny, like where one dictator is over everything. But ultimately, we're trying to figure out ways to limit tyranny in the United States to ensure that government doesn't overstep its boundaries and take away individual liberties, individual freedoms, things like that. Okay? As far as representation goes, the Federalists, theoretically, the Federalists are more elitists. No, not theoretically. That's just true. The Federalists are more elitists, right? Like, the Federalists are the people that think that there should be close to a fairly small political elite ruling class because those people are smarter, better educated, like, just better fit to lead. And the Anti-Federalists sort of oppose that. In fact, they pretty much oppose it. Jefferson, who's one of our leading Anti-Federalists, he's actually sort of the founder of the Anti-Federalist movement. Jefferson basically argues that aristocracy in the United States should be based on merit and talent, right? Do we know what an aristocracy is? Aristocracy would be the ruling class, right? What does merit and talent mean? Talent means you're good. Merit means you've earned it. So if you're good and you earned it, you should rule, right? That's different than like a feudalistic European aristocracy where you just had the right daddy, right? Like you were the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn, so all of a sudden you're the Earl of Sandwich or whatever, the Duke of York. I don't know all the British titles. Okay? All right. The Anti-Federalists do fear a tyranny from a wealthy minority. Interestingly enough, though, the Federalists fear tyranny of the majority, right? Because the Federalist argument as to why a lot of people should be kept out of government is even at the founding of our country, you would have had a whole lot more people that weren't elites, that weren't economic elites, right? Like not the wealthy people, right? Most of the land in America, what is the new United States, is actually owned by a relatively small percentage of the people. Therefore, if the majority who don't own all the land get together and decide they're going to pass legislation to redistribute land, what happens? We redistribute land, and that's like communism, socialism, 50 years before Karl Marx figures out what socialism is. All right? Okay, oh, I'm going the wrong way. I'm like, we went over all of this. Clicking the wrong button. Right? Limiting power, the anti-federalists want a weaker national government. Federalists want a stronger national government. Right? The reality is the Federalists are at least more accurate in the sense that the Articles of Confederation, where we had a weak central government, didn't work. Right? The one guy that we have, the only real guy that we have that exists outside of the party structure is George Washington. And if I've got to throw Washington into a political party, I'm probably throwing him into the Federalists. Right? Just so you understand. All right? The Constitution becomes the supreme law of the land. Any conflict, any issue, any disagreement, theoretically, should all be resolved constitutionally. Right? Now, that means that the Constitution, has to deal with all situations and all scenarios, and this is what gets so complex with with originalism and living constitutional theory. The reality is the U.S. Constitution, whether you're an originalist or a living theorist, is a living document anyways, because it can be changed. It was created with the understanding that it not only could be changed, but would be changed over the course of time. All right? So, that takes us through the Constitution. That's day 2. Are we good? Mm-hmm. Look at that. I'm getting through 40 slides in 30 minutes. I'm proud of myself. I mean, I didn't look at your quiz results from last night, so I don't know if I should really be proud of myself yet.